You are watching programming from the East-West Center in Washington, D.C.
Well, greetings, everyone. Good morning here on the East Coast of the United States, but I know people are joining us at various times around the world. So welcome to the East-West Center in Washington's 60 Minutes for the 60th Anniversary Series of webinars. My name is Situ Lemay. I'm the Vice President of the East-West Center and direct the East-West Center in Washington. Absolutely delighted today to have with us a former East-West Center Fellow, Asia Studies Visiting Fellow, Dr. Alicia Campi, for this seminar in our series. And we are also very honored today to have with us the Ambassador of Mongolia to the United States, Dr. Otkun Bayar. It is just a delight to be able to do this morning's webinar on the subject of Mongolia's response to increasing US-China-Russia rivalry in Asia. For those who are joining us, you all know that Mongolia, of course, has two neighbors, China and Russia, has relations with the United States and, of course, the global community. And it's quite interesting. Many of us who deal with the Indo-Pacific region focus a lot on the US-China competition and its implications. Mongolia's position, geographic position, and trilateralism policies make us think more broadly about the interaction of Mongolia with the US, China, Russia, and also North Korea. So to take up these issues, we have two extraordinarily capable and well-placed persons. As I said, Dr. Alicia Campi was an Asia Studies Visiting Fellow, formerly a Foreign Service Officer in the United States Department of State for almost 15 years. She's had a number of academic appointments, has spent time in Harvard and in the region, including China and Taiwan. Ambassador Otkun Bayar also has an extraordinarily distinguished record. He has not only trained in Moscow, but also in New Delhi, India, so has a perspective from South Asia. And his PhD dissertation is in fact called Security Issues of Small States. So apropos to his practitioner experience representing his government as well. So with that, I really want to maximize the time we hear from them. Both of them have a PowerPoint. I'll ask Dr. Campi, our alumnus, as part of this series to go first. She will do a PowerPoint presentation followed by Ambassador. And I would just note for all of you that today's program is live streamed on YouTube and is on the record. And I would keep that in mind as we move to the Q&A session following the two presentations. With that, let me welcome you both again. Thank you all the participants. Please, Alicia, may I invite you to give your PowerPoint presentation, and I will go to mute now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Satu, and I want to congratulate the East-West Center for its anniversary and for putting together a series of webinars on a variety of very timely topics in order to commemorate this important event. I always remember very fondly my research months with you. They were very stimulating, and it began a very much broader view of approaching Mongolian affairs for me personally in my research. So I thank the East-West Center and you especially for permitting this to happen and enhance my academic career. Today I'm going to talk about Mongolia's response to increasing US, China, Russia rivalry in Asia. On this first slide, you see the topic, and I think that it's important to understand that after 70 years of isolation as a Soviet satellite, Mongolia successfully reinvented itself during the last 30 years as a democratic free market nation integrated into the global marketplace. The vibrancy of Mongolia's democracy is evidenced in its fair and open 7 presidential and 9 parliamentary elections since 1990. Bound by its precarious geographical position on a cold and inhospitable landlocked plateau in the center of the Eurasian continental mass, it is sandwiched between the giant superpowers of Russia and China, its only border neighbors. The country has a long storied history dating back to its founder, Genghis Khan, and with almost 71 million head of livestock in a country with a population of 3.2 million, it still retains strong links to its traditional nomadic heritage, so different from the sedentary agricultural societies that dominate the Asian region. Mongolia has been called, quote, a democratic anchor in an increasingly undemocratic region, which is uniquely positioned to be a role model of successful democratic transition, as well as a case study in how to address the myriad challenges that a new and consolidating democracy faces. Slide 2. All states are deemed to have national strategies. Many researchers have attempted to define and explain the policy-making strategies of China, Russia, and Japan, as well as the United States. But few have considered the geopolitical strategy of Mongolia. Nowadays, observers are wondering how Mongolia is reacting to the growing tensions generated by renewed US, China, Russian rivalry in Asia. However, responding to superpower moves within its region is an old story for Mongolia. While traditionally Mongolia was not a key country for the United States, it has played a linchpin role in Russian, China, and Japan's strategic views about Northeast Asia for hundreds of years. These nations continue to believe that they still must maintain special rights and connections to Mongolia in order to ensure their own national security and economic development, as well as to manage peace in the entire North Asian region. Thus, their actions and attitudes increasingly have attracted the attention of the United States. At a macro level, in the past, Mongolia was viewed as a weak pawn whose fate was determined by the nature of the Sino-Russian relationship. Yet its decision in the beginning of the 20th century to align with Bolshevik Russia preserved its national sovereignty. However, when the Soviet Union disintegrated, it had to define new national priorities. Next slide. However, when the Soviet Union disintegrated in the early 90s, it then found that it had to abandon reliance on just one state and one ideology, and it embraced a multi-pillar foreign policy called the third neighbor policy of balancing its relations with its border neighbors, Russia and China, by reaching out to other democracies, including the United States, Japan, the European Community, and South Korea for political and economic support. This strategy of identifying special friends, labeled third neighbors, was proposed first by US Secretary of State James Baker during a visit to the nation in August 1990 as a way for Mongolia to thwart the tendency of China and Russia to contend for control over Mongolia. Over the succeeding years, the third neighbor policy has become flexible enough to promote relations with industrially advanced nations of the West and East, to consolidate best practices to accelerate Mongolia's transition into the global market economy. Next slide. And in this recent decade, to be reinterpreted in content and meaning to include cultural and economic partners as diverse as India, Brazil, Kuwait, Turkey, Myanmar, and Iran. Although the third neighbor concept is the basis for Mongolia's modern foreign policy, the Mongols always have emphasized that their approach to economic and political security recognizes that both China and Russia rightly should be accorded top priority in their foreign relations, based upon the principle of a balanced, stable, but not necessarily equidistant relationship, and that those border neighbors would be their main trade partners as well as major investors. While the third neighbor policy in the democratic era successfully invigorated the sovereignty of the country and strengthened its political and national security image, it has failed to prevent Chinese monopolization of about 90% of Mongolia's trade for the past 20 years. Next slide. Mongolia's third neighbor policy has led it to see itself and try to sell itself to other countries as a bridge nation. It has become active in North-South Korean issues, Northern Corridor transit routes, border-free trade zones, and international peacekeeping operations. It has chosen both to work through existing mechanisms, such as United Nations multilateral organizations, international movements, including Davos organized economic summits, and Council for Community of Democracy, cooperation with the US by sending Mongolian troops in allied operations in the Middle East and Afghanistan, and increasingly is willing to create its own regional structures to tackle long-standing disputes and bottlenecks, such as the regional security mechanism, the Ulaanbaatar Dialogue on Northeast Asian Security. Moreover, in the last few years, Mongolia has seen itself as a bridge between Northeast and Central Asia in an effort to become part of the region's energy security calculations. Next slide. This reality is realized in Mongolia's adoption of trilateralism policymaking. The first such trilateral relationship is among Mongolia, China, and Russia, which is useful not only in balancing out Chinese and Russian rivalry towards Mongolia, but also when approaching continental Asian problems such as energy, environmental, and transportation development that demand greater Eurasian connectivity. To avoid Western nations misinterpreting this triangular relationship as some kind of a return to the orbit of the two border neighbors, Mongolia has promoted another relationship called democratic trilateralism among Mongolia, the United States, and Japan. It is important to note that these forms of trilateralism emphasize balancing interests, which is why I do not agree that democratic Mongolia is exhibiting a form of bandwagging, which means that a nation aligns with a stronger adversarial power and permits that stronger adversary turned partner to disproportionately gain in the relationship. In fact, I believe that Mongolia's trilateralism strategy, as presently practiced, is viewed as more advantageous for Mongolia's national security and economic development than for its larger partners. And maybe in the question period, I can explain more about my reasoning. Next slide. Mongolia, Russia-China trilateralism owes its origin to the rapprochement between China and Russia that began in 2014 after the Ukrainian crisis. Mongolian President Sakya Elbegdorj recognized that the close cooperation between its giant neighbors, which is based on economic self-interest, could only profit Mongolia if Mongolia had a seat at the negotiating table and participated in drafting new regional transport and energy growth models. Out of concern that a new version of the Eurasian Silk Road that excluded Mongolia was playing out, Elbegdorj used celebrations around the commemoration of different anniversaries in 2014 to formulate his strategy of trilateralism. The Mongols saw this as a long-term strategy to revive Russian economic investment in Mongolia, to build domestic transport infrastructure northward to link with the Trans-Siberian rail system to Pacific partners, as well as south to China, and to promote Mongolia as a reliable and cheaper economic corridor as an alternative in the Eurasian transit zone for Sino-Russian transit traffic. The trilateral policy focused on deepening Mongolian, Russian, and Chinese transnational infrastructure development and economic cooperation through annual summits at the presidential level. And we've had a number of these summits. This is a picture from the most recent summit in 2019 in Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan. And you see Chinese President Xi Jinping, the present Mongolian president, whose name is President Batuluk, with Vladimir Putin. And during this particular summit, President Xi emphasized that the three countries should align their development strategies, which includes for China the Belt and Road, and that they should promote comprehensive cooperation in all fields and publicly support maintaining trilateralism and creating an open world economy. President Putin called for the enhanced interconnectivity in transportation, extension of trade, and bolstering cooperation in energy and finance, while the Mongolian president discussed advancing trilateral cooperation and the construction of a China, Mongolia, Russia economic corridor. Next slide. The plans that I've just mentioned are more than just rhetoric and have systematically in the past few years advanced to a construction phase. The three leaders in 2019 agreed to promote customs facilitation measures among the three countries, propel upgrading and transformation of major ports, and deepen subnational cooperation. Their goal is to construct a network of cross-border highways and strengthening energy cooperation with eventual construction of regional power grids. Next slide. This trilateral economic corridor is proceeding under a Mongolian, Russian, Chinese Northern Railway working group to supervise the construction of new road, rail, and pipeline infrastructure connecting Mongolia and China with Russia. The railroad transportation network is to have mixed rail gauges in order to allow Russian and Chinese trains to enter and exit Mongolia without changing train wheels. If Mongolia constructed all of the northern railway lines with wide Russian gauges and those from the south with narrow Chinese gauges, this rail network could become Russia's gateway to India and Pakistan through Mongolia and China. How does this benefit Mongolia, you might ask? A leading Mongolian economist suggested, if we build a safe, fast, and cheap international trade transit route, Mongolia will naturally prosper from its fees without having to pay a single penny. This time would eventually come where our neighbors are dependent on us, not the other way around. Next slide. I talked about Mongolia's democratic trilateralism policy. This dates back to March 2013, when Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe visited Mongolia, and Abe and the former Mongolian President Elbegdorj agreed in principle to pursue a regular trilateral dialogue with the United States, but its implementation was slow to develop under the Obama administration. With the Trump presidency, this trilateral dialogue, which is pursued at the Secretary of State, Foreign Minister level, has deepened. The Mongols believe this democratic trilateral relationship can invigorate short-term national security and mid to long-term economic cooperation. Next slide. The US has been Mongolia's mainstay in promoting promoting democracy and free market reforms for the past 30 years. It structured international assistance to rescue Mongolia's collapsed socialist economy in the 1990s and engineered its entrance into the World Trade Organization. The two nations enjoy strong military and disaster preparedness cooperation, while Mongolia still retains loose military ties to Russia. However, the reality is that during the last decade of mineral resource development, the U.S. economic position in Mongolia has been steadily eroding. The U.S. is not a major player in Mongolian rail and transport development, which is seen as the key to Mongolia's future economy and trade diversification. Both the United States and Mongolia recognize that continuing economic weakness plagues the bilateral relationship and encourages Chinese and Russian influence in the country as well as the whole Eurasian region. During the Obama presidency, American retrenchment from Mongolia damaged the U.S. public reputation by increasing the sense of U.S. abandonment in the minds of Mongolian citizens and in some official circles. In the Trump era, because of deteriorating relations with both China and Russia, and hopes that Mongolia can continue to be a bridge to North Korea to stabilize DPRK behavior, the White House raised its relationships with Mongolia to the strategic partnership level in 2019. And here you see a picture of President Batulik with President Trump. And it supported specific most favored nation Kashmir textile bills in Congress to energize U.S.-Mongolian economic relations. However, the COVID-19 pandemic has frozen many bilateral initiatives while intensifying medical assistance cooperation. Next slide. As for Japan, Mongolia recognizes that Japan has great interest in Mongolian minerals and has the potential to be a sizable trade partner if transportation connectivity within Northeast Asia is achieved. The United States has no objection to a strong Mongolian-Japanese economic and cultural relationship, especially since it can be a balance to both China and Russia. Japanese investment in Mongolian mining and major industrial projects have ebbed and flowed over the years, but the Japanese-Mongolian relationship strengthened significantly under the prime ministership of Abe. Although Mongolia and Japan already had a strategic partnership in 2010, Abe stressed that the two nations shared common values, not only in terms of bilateral relations, but also with regard to regional and global issues. Because of the present anti-nuclear climate in Japan, investing in Mongolian uranium is on the back burner. But the Japanese now exhibit strong interest in developing Mongolia's rare earth minerals because of trade friction with the Chinese. Although rail and pipeline transportation problems remain major inhibitors to any major increase in Japanese mineral investment and mineral purchases, Japan strongly supports trilateralism with the US and Mongolia as a way to broker negotiations with North Korea and as a way to temper Chinese influence on the Asian continent. Final slide. So now with my conclusion, during Chinese imperial and Cold War times, it is true that Mongolia often calculated that one or the other of its border neighbors was needed for protection, and that the cost of simultaneously opposing both would be disastrous. In the democratic era since 1990, Mongolia has become adept in managing the reality that its big neighbors seek to be involved in Mongolian internal affairs and so must be managed in the most efficacious way possible rather than ignored. It developed its third neighbor, trilateralism, and bridge nation policies to reassure Russia and China while also attempting to diversify its political and trade options and connect itself to the wider global market to strengthen its national security. In the past 10 years, as Mongolia has emerged in Eurasia as a rapidly growing mineral-based economy, the country increasingly has raised its profile in international affairs to promote its own vision of Eurasian regional synergy and integration. But with globalization and connectivity come complications, as the COVID-19 crisis has taught us all. Mongolia is now part of the new economic great game in Eurasia that today is heavily influenced by the Sino-Russian cooperation that is perceived as threatening to the US and its allies. Its economic development is linked to maintaining regional stability and promoting the development and prosperity of all Asian countries. At the same time, Mongolia understands that it is a new democracy between two giant authoritarian nations. So it recognizes the limits of its geospace, and it must strive to reach out to like-minded nations such as the United States, Japan, and other democratic nations for investment, economic, civil society, and military ties to buttress its national identity and security. It cannot escape being influenced by the Sino-US and Russo-US relationships, which always have been complicated and today are particularly confrontative. So when the US looks at the Mongolia-China-Russia triangle, it should not simplistically see the two stronger powers incentivizing Mongolian cooperation through trade and transit agreements to create an economic corridor. It should recognize that creating an economic corridor permits Mongolia to utilize its democratic trilateralism and third neighbor policies to build a balancing coalition which strengthens its national security to overcome its landlocked geography. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you very much, Alicia. That was really terrific and thoughtful, and I know we will get to questions and discussion, but let me immediately turn to Ambassador Okumbayar so that we hear his perspective as well before we invite participants to join for the discussion. Ambassador.
Oh, good morning. Thank you, Alicia, for really interesting and many interesting ideas. And I would like to thank East West Center for providing this opportunity for a meeting of us over the internet. COVID-19 does have its bad sides as well as good sides, which would allow us to have a meeting of this sort. And I hope that everybody who is joining us today are in good health in these challenging times of COVID-19. To start with, I would like just to say that Mongolia does have 288 confirmed cases of COVID-19, all imported, no internal breaks. So we have been pretty successful in dealing with that. And also Mongolia extended help to Russia, China, and the United States as a humanitarian assistance during these COVID-19 times. For example, to the United States, we have delivered 60,000 personal protective equipment, which were received by FEMA to be distributed in Nevada and Arizona. And second observation related with the COVID is that we have held successfully our parliamentary elections on June 24th. And voter turnout was very high, to my surprise, even higher than in previous elections when we did not have COVID-19, 73%. So it was a quite successful example of dealing with the COVID-19 situation. Coming back to the main topic, I would like to start with citing the article of the National Security Concept of Mongolia, which says good neighborly and friendly relations and all-around cooperation with Russian Federation and People's Republic of China shall be developed. More specifically, national interests and the history of bilateral relationship shall be taken into account, while regional peace and stability, as well as general balance of relations with neighbors, shall be sought. Based on this, foreign policy concept of Mongolia states that maintaining of good neighborly relations with Russia and China is a priority of foreign policy of Mongolia. The country has established comprehensive strategic partnership with both of its neighbors. That's the highest level of diplomatic relations of Mongolia up to date. For example, in 2016, we have signed a midterm plan with Russia to implement the strategic partnership. And last year, we stated that our bilateral relations came to the state of comprehensive strategic partnership. Well, historically, Mongolian and Russian ties are understandable to everybody. I would not like to spend the time on that. As on last year, Mongolia's trade with Russia was 1.8 billion US dollars. And right now, Russia suggested for Mongolia to join Eurasian Economic Union in order to establish a free trade agreement with Russia and other member countries. Right now, we have organized expert groups to research benefits of joining the organization. And from last year onwards, both countries started feasibility study for the project of gas pipeline through Mongolia to China. With China, I should say that we do have also comprehensive strategic partnership relations. In 1994, both countries have signed an agreement on friendly relations and cooperation, according to which both countries committed to reciprocal non-interference in domestic affairs, reciprocal respect for territorial integrity and sovereignty of the two nations. I should say that Mongolia pursues a policy of one China. In other way, Tibet and Taiwan, these countries are officially recognized as part of China. Mongolia-China bilateral trade was, in 2018, it was 8.6 billion US dollars. That's around 66% of the total foreign trade of Mongolia. From these two neighbors, I also would like to jump to the third neighbor policy, which Alicia was mentioning here. It's not new concept. Alicia would know very well that since first declaration of independence in 1911 and 1921, Mongolia was actively seeking establishment of relations with the Western nations, starting with Great Britain, France, and there were quite a few attempts to establish relations with the United States in early 1920s. Just recently, one of the Mongolian scholars have found very interesting letters sent by Mongolian authorities, obviously in 1944, to Mongolian incarnate Lama in the United States, Dilev Hutuktu, requesting him to explore the possibilities of establishment of relations with the United States. Well, who would believe that was really communist times, and that was under Stalin and Choibalsan, and Mongolian authorities were seeking the establishment of relations with the United States at that time. That's what's an interesting fact. When we are coming to the third neighbor policy, as Alicia mentioned in her presentation, we do understand that under third neighbors are developed nations. Some say that's like-minded democracies in the East, in the West. So that includes United States, Japan, South Korea, India, European Union, and even Turkey. With the United States, we have established diplomatic relations in 1987. The attempts of establishment of diplomatic relations took over 20 years, I guess. It started with John Kennedy when he was a president. First attempts were made. Unfortunately, the atmosphere of the Cold War prevented the establishment of diplomatic relations, and we finally officially established relations in 1987. And for the last 33 years now, these relations have developed successfully into a really good one. In 2018, when Mongolian Prime Minister visited the United States, both governments agreed that our relations came to the stage of expanded comprehensive partnership. And last year, when Mongolian President visited DC, both presidents announced our relations to be of strategic partnership. So in the short term, we came to a really good stage. There is a very successful military relations development between our two countries. The United States is helping Mongolian military to increase and strengthen its peacekeeping capacities. Mongolian soldiers have participated in peacekeeping operations in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and right now we still have 2 battalions in Afghanistan. And also we do have sizable peacekeeping force in Sudan under UN mandate. And from the slide, that's the Mongolian trade with China, Russia, and the United States. So in physical terms, you can see that Mongolian United States trade is 30 times lower than Mongolia-China trade and 6 times smaller than Mongolia-Russia trade. That's just for the visuality. Can you do the next slide? As far as the investment, I mean, if we are going to have a strategic relationship, we need to have a really investments too. And as you can see, that US investment is almost 8 times less than Chinese investment into Mongolian economy. When we see these figures, both sides have agreed that really economic relations are needed to receive a new momentum. There are multiple opportunities that are being discussed. For example, Tavan Tolgoi power plant, which Mongolian government is planning to start building next year. There has been discussions about Northeast Asian supergrid, energy supergrid, or copper smelting factory based on the copper mine in the south of Mongolia. By the way, in the beginning of this year, we had a round of Mongolia, US, Japan trilateral meeting, and during this meeting, all 3 sides have agreed that we should pay much more attention on the possibility of increasing economic cooperation, including cooperation in energy sector. Having said this, I also should say Mongolia's achievement with other third neighbors. For example, with Japan, we concluded, well, I would say the first ever free trade agreement. It's called Economic Partnership Agreement, signed during the visit of Mongolian president to Tokyo. With the European Union, we have partnership and cooperation agreement that allows us GSP plus trade scheme. Well, as I mentioned earlier, that also Mongolian side is studying the possibility of free trade agreement with the Eurasian Economic Union. With the United States, we do have ongoing discussions with the Trade and Investment Framework Agreement, which took I would say, very long discussions. I think now it's almost 10 years that we are discussing this agreement. And in my opinion, that we are being a little bit late with trade agreements. Mongolian side is really thinking about possibility of the free trade agreements with the United States. Because first of all, United States historically had always trade surplus in its trade with Mongolia. So establishing free trade agreement would be for the benefit of the United States. Second is that, I believe that we should not look at Mongolia as Mongolia when we are talking about bilateral trade agreement. As you can see, Mongolia does have 3 million population, yes. But if you take Mongolian speaking market in this region, that's about 1.5 million in Russia and 25 million in China. Altogether, Mongolian speaking market constitutes about 30 million. That's equal to the Benelux market. If you see, that's about also 30 million, Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg. So this is, this is an opportunity that we should look upon, because most companies, they believe when they see 3 million population, they say that it's too small market to enter with. And secondly, I believe that there is also another opportunity. A lot of American and Japanese companies are planning to move their production facilities from China to elsewhere. So Mongolia could be one place for their relocation in terms of its raw material availability. That's some vision that we should also look upon. Also, right now, the Congress is planning to consider Mongolia Third Neighbor Trade Act that has been proposed by some members of Congress, and this is some people believe that it's anti-China move, but I would say that actually under this Third Neighbor Trade Act, we are just looking for the level playing field. Actually, Mongolia is a landlocked country. Anything produced in Mongolia has to be cheaper than in the country than the goods produced in the countries which does have an access to the sea. So basically, under this trade act, we are looking for the equal possibility for Mongolian production, for Mongolian products, and it is very important at this moment to look into this legislation, because 1/3 of the Mongolian population is dependent on the income from Kashmir. So if we adopt this legislation, there's going to be a really big say for the household income of the 1/3 of the population of this country. Well, coming to the great power rivalry, I think Alicia is right. The situation of the great power rivalry is not new for Mongolia. Last century, Mongolia was living in the situation of the Cold War rivalry between US and USSR. And during the Cold War, we have lived in situation in a mini Cold War. The Sino-Soviet conflict in Mongolia was at the border of this conflict. So this situation of rivalries are really not new for Mongolia's external environment. And also, as you can see, Mongolia is intertwined with its two neighbors, both in terms of geography, in terms of history, and in terms of economy. And what we are trying to promote is the more economic partnership with the third neighbor countries, so that our interaction with third neighbors are much greater. In these terms, Mongolia is supportive for any proposal that would strengthen the economic development, prosperity in the region, increasing mutual trust and stability in the region, provided that there is no hidden agendas. And in that sense, we do regard all the initiatives related with the Eurasian Economic Union, Belt and Road Initiative, or Indo-Pacific strategy as ideas that can be supported. As I mentioned, that Mongolia, Russia, and China have agreed that there could be a lot of cooperation along Mongolia's border, and when you see that big economies surrounding you is coming into the movement, inevitably you have to move along these movements because you cannot leave out of these movements. So Mongolia, of course, is looking for the possibility to be connected and to gain from those possibilities when these new projects are coming out. So Mongolia have signed in the memorandum of understanding to harmonize Mongolia's project development road development project in harmonization with the Belt and Road project suggested by China. Also, we are looking into the possibilities of connecting China and Russia by a gas pipeline through Mongolia, etc. As far as U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy is concerned, we already signed successfully $350 million MCC compact, second compact with the United States. We are looking into much more active approach from U.S. companies, U.S. private sector to look into the opportunities that are arising in this market. And in the end, I would like to say that there is a great role for the research community in this regard, because as I mentioned earlier, that a lot of people, especially business people, when look at Mongolia with 3 million population, they do not regard as a market worth of interest. But we should promote, all the researchers should promote and underline the advantage that Mongolia would offer. First of all, it's democratic setup. Second, it's favorable investment conditions. Actually, Mongolia is ranked 74th out of the 190 countries in the World Bank's Doing Business Index of 2019, and also ranked 10th within East Asia and Pacific group. Mongolia's reach of mineral resources and also geographical proximity to the markets, and also availability of Western educated and English speaking skilled and young labor force. You won't believe that during COVID-19 outbreak, when Mongolia started repatriating its citizens, I found out that there are quite a few Mongolians in Mozambique, in Botswana. And I was wondering what Mongolians are doing in Botswana or in Mozambique. You won't believe these are people from Mongolian mines who came to Mozambique and Botswana to train their staff over there, and they got stranded there. So there is a lot of possibilities that we could look. And I believe that the research community would play very important role in this regard. Having said this, I would like to conclude my brief introduction here, and if there is any question, I would be happy to answer.
Ambassador, thank you so much for that presentation. I really appreciated how you framed that and the challenges that Mongolia is facing, but also the approaches Mongolia is taking. It's quite interesting given the fluidity and flux of great power relations, but also some of the economic elements that are emerging in the region. And that last point about mining experts from Mongolia in Africa, working in Africa, was quite fascinating. Look, I'm very conscious that we have only about 8 minutes in the scheduled program. Kindly, the ambassador and Dr. Campi have kindly agreed to extend our time a few minutes, but we do have to stop by about 11:05 because we are, as I said, live streaming on YouTube for those who are not joining. So I am going to read questions. There are already 2, and I have a couple as well, but let me go immediately to the queue. We have a question from, and I will identify the speakers because this is an on-the-record program. Mr. Mark Tokala asks, with rising nationalism in China, are Mongolians in Inner Mongolia feeling any pressure to demonstrate their loyalty to Xi Jinping and the Chinese state? How much interaction is there between Mongolia and Inner Mongolia these days? And many of you know Mr. Tokala was, of course, a US State Department officer leading our effort there in Mongolia for some years before he left the State Department. So Ambassador, would you like to start on that question, and then we can have input from Dr. Campi as well?
Thank you very much. I will try to be as short as possible. First of all, as I mentioned, we cannot enter into discussion of inner political matters of People's Republic of China. Mongolians do have a lot of interaction with Inner Mongolia in terms of economy, in terms of cultural and other relations, and actually Inner Mongolia is considered to be one of the bridges that should develop the relations with Mongolia as far as China is concerned. You know that they have a policy, for example, Guanyin is allocated to Korea, Inner Mongolia is allocated to Mongolia, etc., because of the geographical proximity and also no language barriers. So in these terms, there are quite a lot of interactions. But of course, as far as inner Chinese political issues are concerned, I have no comment on that.
Thank you, Ambassador. Dr. Campi, do you wish to offer anything on the question?
Well, what I can say is, first of all, this is a very delicate issue for Mongolian government authorities, such as the ambassador, because there are no outstanding disputes between the two countries on borders, for example. Yet there's a lot of cross-border traffic. There are border points open in the summertime, which Mongols can take advantage of, foreigners cannot, to move products back and forth between the Gobi provinces of Mongolia and the Inner Mongolian Autonomous Region. Also, during the crisis of COVID, it's interesting to see how coal deliveries, which were initially stopped and then quickly resumed by the Mongols across the border, mainly because Mongolia is so dependent on China as a purchaser of Mongolian coal, and to restrict these coal trucks going back and forth across the border to deliver to Chinese clients, often located in the Inner Mongolian areas, would just destroy the Mongolian economy. Of course, Mongolia is aware of the Inner Mongolian protest movements and political problems within the country. There are non-governmental organizations within Mongolia that are monitoring this and to some way maybe assisting. But in general, the Mongolian government, while abroad in the embassies, are open to discussions and participation in various conferences and research forums of people representing the Mongolia diaspora, whether we're talking about China or in Russia. Basically, the Mongolian government tries to have walk a very fine line with the Inner Mongolian issue, so that it doesn't become involved in in the internal minority problems with China. And Mongolia is not in a position, because of its landlocked situation, to exert via public commentary like the US State Department does about Chinese minority policy. It doesn't mean that it has no interest, but it does this in a low-key way.
Well, thank you very much. We have two other questions in the Q&A, and I will read them, as I said, for our viewers on YouTube. Miss Masako Ikegami, based in Tokyo and joining us from Tokyo, welcome, asks, particularly I think for the ambassador, but of course Dr. Kempe too, China's FDI and economic dominance in Mongolia compromises Mongolia's diplomatic balancing efforts. If this continues, she draws an analogy, if this continues, Mongolia faces a risk to be made into Manchukuo, made by Imperial Japan, as you recall, in the 1930s, might suffer the same situation under China. How to prevent this? Do you have any thoughts about this dependence on FDI and trade with China? Are there paths out of it? You did discuss some avenues, such as the Japan agreement on the CEPA, and your trade with Russia and even the United States, such as proposing an agreement with the US. So could you please elaborate, Ambassador, and then Dr. Kempe, if you have any thoughts?
Well, thank you very much. As far as dependency on China is concerned, I think now we are living at the stage when the whole world is realizing that they are dependent on China, not only Mongolia. So, well, we are neighbor to China, and it is inevitable that China will be dependent, will be influencing on our economic relations, and they will continue to have this kind of situation in foreseeable future. Having said this, I would rather look at this problem not from the angle of dependency, but from the angle of the opportunity. Often we say that Mongolia is a landlocked country, but I always think that we should think about the country as a country which is living on the shores of the human sea, which is called China. This is a big market, and we do have a Mongolian-speaking population over there. It's a great opportunity, so we should look into these possibilities into the future. And I believe that Manchukuo situation will not be repeated. I can rest assure you that, because we were ruling China for 300 years, but we have not got assimilated. And we do have our own lessons. Manchukuo ruled another 300, Manchus ruled another 300 years, but they have got assimilated. So in that sense, I think we do have our own lessons.
Thank you. Dr. Kempe, do you quickly want to add anything here? Otherwise, we'll move to the next question.
I just wanted to say that I find the historical analogy probably does not hold. One has to remember, with the trilateralism policy, even if you discount third neighbors such as Japan and the United States, we cannot expect that Russia would just stand idly by if China were ever to, in some more formal way, try to incorporate independent Mongolia into its political boundaries. Mongolia's smart policy of the economic corridor, as well as the trilateralism, allows it to move from one big power to the other on specific issues, and move closer in one area and further away in another area. Just because right now it has this strong tie to China, we have to remember it's tied mainly by coal. and China has changing policies and plans for the exploitation, reduced exploitation of coal in its industries. So if you look even midterm, Mongolia recognizes that this coal trade between Mongolia and China is going to be reduced. And so that obviously then changes the trade picture between the two countries.
Thank you. And finally, we have a question. I'm afraid this is the last one we have time for, though. I have so many questions, but we will have to find another time. Our colleague Thomas Lum from the Congressional Research Service asked, what is the difference between Mongolia, Russia, China infrastructure development plans, such as those you showed on the slides, and China's Belt and Road Initiative? Is there an overlap where those the trilateral ones and China's own infrastructure plans? And he suggests that Mongolia seems to have more influence in how the projects are designed, and asks, is this in fact the case? Is this so that Mongolia has more leverage or influence on how what those plans are?
I mentioned earlier that Mongolia is studying the possibility to harmonize its infrastructure development with the regional infrastructure projects. Okay, you may call it Belt and Road Initiative or China-Russia corridor through Mongolia. It's inevitable because it's an opportunity, and you know, you can have a possibility of gaining through the transit trade and transit goods through Mongolia. But on the other hand, Mongolia does have its own infrastructure development projects. I would say that, okay, if vertical lines of infrastructure connecting Russia and China are being developed through the international cooperation, and we are studying the possibility of incorporating them into the regional plans, we do have our own plans of developing the horizontal infrastructure projects, which is connecting, I mean, eastern and western regions of Mongolia. Right now, in these days, Mongolia is building a railroad from Tawantalwa mines in south of Mongolia into the Zumbayan, that's connecting Russia-China railroad, connecting to the Russia-China railroad. And the plans are that from these railroads, they will go more to the eastwards to the another areas. So that's what we call it horizontal infrastructure development. So we do have our own plans, and whatever is coming along the lines of the international cooperation, we try to incorporate those plans with the international plans.
Thank you. Dr. Kampe, just to close out, please.
I have done a lot of study on this particular issue that was raised in the question. I just simplistically want to say that, number one, the important thing to understand when you look at all the rail plans and highway plans is, first of all, Mongolia, which has only one north-south railroad and no east-west railroad across the whole country, is on Russian gauge. And it has almost no Chinese gauge rail. And the new development policies actually are continuing the Russian gauge. Mongolia has asked, with Russian support, and this is where Russia can influence these development policies, to build new Russian gauge spurs so that the mining products which are in the south of Mongolia close to China can be moved north and then out to the east to other partners, potentially like Japan and Korea. That's number one. Number two is the reason why Mongolia, as a transit country for both gas and for rail, which was shown very clearly in the ambassador's slides, the reason that this idea is gaining momentum and moving into implementation is because of money. Russia did not have the money to support its share of Chinese-Russian bilateral plans in these areas. And it was China that was constantly being asked to fund everything. And with Belt and Road and the funding demands of Belt and Road from many other different nations, the economic advantageous quality of transiting directly through Mongolia instead of taking these circuitous routes only through Russian territory into Chinese territory around into Manchuria became something that both China and Russia agreed to, because that was a much cheaper way to link the two big superpowers.
Well, thank you. I would just flag there that Dr. Kempe has a new 2019 April book on Mongolia's foreign policy, Navigating a Challenging World. And I would ask folks who are interested in further elaboration on the themes we've discussed today to look at that book. But I'm afraid we do have to conclude. We're about 10 minutes over our time. We have a number of East-West Center in Washington programs coming up. I count 7 coming up between now and the end of August on everything ranging from Japan's decision on missile defense to demographic change and security implications in Northeast Asia to issues related to the US-Philippine relations. So I would urge you, if you're not on our mailing list, to join us. And stay tuned for future programs and announcements. And let me bring this program to a conclusion by simply saying thank you to Dr. Kempe for being an East-West Center Asia Studies Visiting Fellow and continuing our engagement and relations with you and your terrific work on Mongolia and Northeast Asia. We're delighted to have you back in this 60 minutes for the 60th anniversary. And Dr. and Ambassador Otkun Bayar, thank you so much for joining us today. I want you to know that amongst our alumni are a member of the Mongolian National Security Council think tank who is with us also, and Dr. Kempe worked with her. And we're looking forward to more students and exchanges with Mongolia as conditions permit after the current environment. So we really look forward to maintaining the East-West Center's strong engagement on Mongolia issues and Mongolian expertise and scholarship. So thank you both very much. Thank you all participants for joining. Please be safe, be well, and good day. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Right.